Good evening, everybody. How are you? This is Enrique from Spanish United. I'm your director moderator tonight on the show. I have a very good friend of mine for many years. Trinity, would you be so kind to introduce yourself to the audience?
Good evening. My name is Trinity Bustria. I am a personal friend of Rick's. I happen to tutor in English and develop English as a second language, instructional and educational materials. I'm currently contemplating which graduate programs to apply to involving Arabic and global security studies. I happen to live in California just like Rick, and I am Filipino on my dad's side. And within our Filipino ancestry, we are part Spanish and Filipino Chinese. Our Filipino Chinese ancestors migrated to the Philippines when the islands were part of the Spanish Empire, and by virtue of them becoming baptized Roman Catholics and learning the Spanish language, my Chinese ancestors became Spanish subjects. So they essentially Hispanicized themselves. And given these details, that's more or less my Hispanic background and context.
Excellent, excellent. So I wanted to discuss tonight about Asian Hispanics and Hispanics from Latin America and how we can better integrate both communities and have a better dialogue and exchange. So what do you think can be done for for Asian Hispanics to be recognized as being Hispanic and to be part of the wider Hispanic community?
Sure. So a few things. One, to speak to your question, Asian Hispanics, i.e., Filipino people, would have to first regard themselves as a Hispanic people, right? And even within that, if Filipinos were to identify as Hispanic, they, in my view, would need to emphasize that they are not quite the same in a Hispanic sense as Peninsular Spaniards, and they are not also like fashion quite the same as Hispanics from Latin America or quote unquote Spanish Americans. They would have to basically affirm that they are an Asian people, and if they want to be more specific, Austronesian people. Within that, Filipinos would have to basically realize that their own culture and civilization, although it is Austronesian, or as they would understandably but incorrectly say Malay, is an Hispanic culture and civilization. So basically, Filipinos would have to want to first identify as Hispanic and be willing and able to explain and define what it means to be a certain type or kind of Hispanic Asian. Secondly, in order to answer your original question, Filipinos would have to want to learn Spanish, and luckily that's going on in the islands, but they would also want to have to get to a place where they're comfortable with restoring Spanish as an official language. This, I mean, if I may, I want to address this point a little further. We have numerous laws in the Philippines still on the books that were originally written in Spanish. There are numerous legal documents that were only written in Spanish and are still untranslated. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but up until the 60s and early 70s, the Supreme Court of the Philippines would hear our oral arguments on occasion in Spanish, and the justices would even deliberate amongst themselves in Spanish. So what that means is that the Spanish language is very much part of the Philippines' legislation or legislative history. I guess people are having fun outside of those fireworks. Okay, the Spanish language is very much part of the Philippines' legislative and judicial history. So it just would make sense for Filipinos, in order for them to just know themselves on a legislative and judicial level, they would need to know some Spanish.
Hmm.
Furthermore, arguably our most celebrated literature amongst ourselves is only in Spanish. Jose Rizal only penned, or sorry, he solely penned his most praised works in the Spanish language.
Hmm.
On top of that, we Filipinos have written respectable dramas, short stories, and prose in Spanish that's been highly acclaimed by academics from Mexico, Argentina, other Latin countries, and if you could believe this, Spain. So, what I'm trying to say is that we Filipinos would have to acknowledge that, as I said before, we're an Hispanic people, but then in order for us to appreciate that, we would have to restore Spanish as an official language and care to use it,
Hmm.
especially on our terms, knowing that our civilization was not solely, but absolutely built and fostered by way of our use of the Spanish language. The third and last thing I want to note for now is that Filipinos would need to would need to as they feel more comfortable with Spanish, they would need to proactively reach out to Latin America, Spain, and the two other Hispanic countries in Africa, namely the United Arab Sahrawi Democratic Republic. I think I said their full
Yes,
official name
correct.
right, and
Right.
Equatorial Guinea. So, and in fact, you may find this interesting. Under the Philippines' second or third president, who was an Ilocano of Chinese descent and near native Spanish speaker, he actually went out of his way to keep the Philippines in the global Hispanic bloc of nations. When he would get off the plane in a Latin country or a Spanish American country, he would right away speak in Spanish. When he got off the plane in Franco, Spain, he did the same thing. He right away spoke in Spanish. I mean, that's the kind of man he was. He was self-aware that, or not self-aware, he was fully aware that Filipinos are not only a certain kind of special Asian Pacific Hispanics, but if they're going to have a meaningful place amongst the community of nations, they need to be big players amongst the Hispanic bloc. In fact, under his presidency, this particular president ensured that his own ambassador to the United Nations would regularly meet and consult with all the Spanish countries that had a presence at the UN. So I'm of the view that what needs to be done with respect to your question is that Filipinos, as I said, after they feel that they are proficient in the Spanish language, after having re-embraced it on their own terms, with respect for who they are as a people and what their ancestors have accomplished in and with the Spanish language, they need to, in the 21st century, intentionally and dynamically reach out to all the world's Hispanic nations and basically gr- proactively draw all the other Spanish speaking countries toward them. One thing, I'll end with this for now. One thing the Filipinos could do, again, after they develop a certain kind of proficiency in the Spanish language, is say, hey, we understand you folks. You folks are beginning to know of us again or get a better understanding of who we are. We are more than willing and able to serve as intermediary forces between you and the rest of Asia.
Hmm.
Yes, the Philippines would have to, at some point in the future, put herself out there as a point of nexus between all the Latin world, the Hispanic world in particular, with and Asia.
Hmm. I agree with you. I was also reading that in 2007, the the president of the Philippines at the time, I think that was Gloria Arroyo. She signed a directive with Spain for reintroducing Spanish into the Philippine school system in 2008. So it has been
Right.
reintroduced again. And
It has, but that sadly, if I may quickly interject,
sure, go ahead.
that law hasn't been necessarily upheld. So to speak a little to that history, I think it needs to be noted that although some efforts have been made in the last 2 to 3 years to encourage more schools to adopt Spanish, the current and last Filipino presidential administrations haven't essentially pursued that memorandum of understanding between Spain and the Philippines. Furthermore, and last comment for now, the let's see, the Philippines are in the Philippines. The Spanish language is practically official in a de jure sense in one respect. If anybody wanted to become a naturalized citizen of the Philippines, he or she would have to demonstrate spoken and literary proficiency in English, Tagalog, any native language or any language recognized as being official in any province, and lastly, Spanish. I say this because on because at the end of the day, the only way in which the Filipino government takes the Spanish language seriously, especially at an official level, is in just two regards. One, the Filipino government has a Ministry of Foreign Affairs with Spanish-speaking staff, with full ambassadors to Spanish-speaking countries. And lastly, if anybody wants to become a naturalized citizen of the Philippines, those laws in the books that list Spanish as a language of naturalization still apply. But with respect to that memorandum of understanding, sadly, it's not taken so seriously.
I also wanted to ask, how would you describe Asian Hispanic relations with other Hispanic groups in the United States and the diaspora? How would you say it is?
Excellent, excellent. My view is that, as I said, they are excellent. This is because I've seen on at least two social media platforms Filipinos who could converse in Spanish going through Latin countries and even Spain, highlighting positive experiences. In addition to that, I've also encountered on forums some Filipinos who speak Chabacano, that's a Creole Spanish, highlighting that they had positive experiences when different Spanish speakers from Spain and Latin countries would come through their parts of Mindanao, especially the city of Zamboanga, where Chabacano is spoken, and how these Spanish-speaking Hispanics got along with them and vice versa. Furthermore, I've noticed on, let's see, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, a bunch of Filipinos who migrated to the Philippines or born in the Philippines or who are part Filipino and Peninsular Spanish celebrating their hybridity, or where this applies, dual nationality, and that these are dual citizens of both Spain and the Philippines. And it seems like they're enjoying themselves. And I can tell you, as a Southern California, as your fellow Southern Californian, I've spoken with various Mexican Americans, and they positively remarked that not only do they like Filipinos, and it seems that Filipinos like them and their fellow Mexican Americans, but they, as coming from my Mexican American friends and acquaintances, had positive experiences with Filipinos, and they remarked that they felt that there were just too many similarities, and if they were cousins. I could also tell you that if you go to San Diego, amongst families that are mixed Mexican and Filipino, they proudly and openly identify as Mexipino. Lastly, I can tell you that you go to the Glendale Eagle Rock area close to where you live, there are some Filipino Americans who don't strongly identify as Asian, but they interestingly enough self-identify as Latino because they have close associations and meaningful childhood experiences from the neighborhood or school with different Hispanics, especially Mexican Americans, and
Mm-hmm.
they feel more Hispanic, as they would say Latino, than Asian.
Mm.
And so I would say that these anecdotes that I know of and that I've even like say observed from a distance or up close reflect overall positive relations and relationships between Filipinos and their, in this case, Spanish American or let's see, Latin American Hispanic counterparts.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And also another thing is that since most Filipinos have Spanish last names, most people would identify as them as being Hispanic. The only difference is that they look different from other Hispanic because they have, Asian features, but they
And where this
have Spanish
applies,
last.
or if this applies, Eurasian features.
Well, yeah, you could say that.
Well, if I so let me contextualize that comment. I have people in my own family who look more Eurasian. My grandmother's brothers look Eurasian. She and her sisters look very Chinese,
Hmm.
but they are that is my grandmother and her siblings. They are of Austronesian, European, Spanish, and Southern Chinese, Hokkien Chinese in particular descent. And so
Hmm.
what I'm trying to say is that it's like, as per my own lived experience, I know of some Filipinos that look Eurasian. And so that's one reason why, in my view, building off what you said, a lot of Filipinos are not readily regarded as Hispanic because they look very Asian, right? Pronouncedly Asian. And if they don't look so Asian, they look Eurasian. And let's just be honest. There aren't that, although there are Eurasian Hispanics in, say, Central and definitely South America and, okay, Spain here and there, here in our own country, that is the United States of America, there aren't that many Eurasian Hispanics or people who openly identify as Hispanic who look very Eurasian.
Hmm.
That's what I'm trying to
Hmm.
comment on.
Yeah, Asian Hispanics tend to be few in number, and depending on where their ancestry comes from, sometimes they are grouped together, into Chinese American or Korean American communities, because you had Asians that settled, in many countries in Latin America, that came from China, Japan, Korea, and they speak fluent Spanish, but because of their last names and because of what they look like, from what I've seen that they tend to be excluded from the Hispanic communities. So, and many times, a lot of them are forced to assimilate into the ethnicity that their ancestors came from. Like you have a lot of Cuban Chinese that had to assimilate into Chinese culture because when they came here to the States, they were excluded from the Cuban community, even though they spoke nothing but Spanish.
Absolutely. Now, when it comes to some Korean Hispanics or Korean Latin Americans, I would argue that in California, sometimes that was by choice, or oftentimes that was by choice, simply because if we were to consider the socioeconomic status of South, oh sorry, Southern sorry, yes, that's right, Southern California's Korean communities, oftentimes a lot of Latin American Koreans would choose to go to those communities because those communities have a lot of stability and success.
Hmm.
And mind you, what I'm talking about reflects later ethnic Korean migration, regardless of country of origin, to the United States. So what I'm talking about is a little later than the than in a Chinese Cuban or Cuban Chinese migration to the United States. But even then, what's interesting to note is, and I'm going to assume you already knew this, that numerous Central and South American Koreans strongly identify as Hispanic or Latino even when they're here. In fact, I can tell you that's true of Argentine or Argentine and Chilean Koreans, that they still identify with either their parents' South American country or their own South American country, especially if they came here as older adults. In fact, I had a professor during my upper division undergraduate education, who was South Korean, naturalized American citizen, who spoke of a friend of hers from Chile of Korean descent who strongly identified as Latina. So much so, as per my former professor's retelling of something, her Chilean Korean friend would sometimes say, "We Latinos think or feel about this topic this way," or "We Latinos think and feel fill in the blank."
Mhm.
And I would say that my former professor's friend's way of self-identifying as Latino and with Latinos is reflective of the fact that her friend, as well as these other adult Korean Latin American adults who this applies to, oftentimes came here as older adults where they spent their major meaningful formative years in a South American country. Hence, they can't help but see themselves as a certain kind of Asian or Korean Latino.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes, I definitely agree with that. And also, you have a lot of Asian Latinos that also come from Peru, also come from Bolivia, from Paraguay,
Right.
and they come here, and even though they speak Spanish, from what I've noticed is that in many instances they tend to be ostracized by both groups, from both
Right.
the Asian
So
community
with
and
that
from the Hispanic
stated,
community.
absolutely. So with that stated, now we're entertaining that aspect of your original question has to deal with how can Latin American Hispanics or Spanish Americans stop I don't want to say stop, but like better recognize, and let's go one further, appreciate their Asian Hispanic counterparts. So earlier in this exchange, I spoke about the Filipino aspect of this, right? And I
Mhm.
stressed that Filipinos need to proactively do what they can on their own terms, using their own reasonable definitions, self-identify and present themselves as Asian Hispanics. Now we're talking about Asian Hispanics who are from the Americas, right?
Mhm.
Now, with that all stated, I'm of the view that non Asian, Latin American Hispanics or Spanish Americans would need to realize that, for one thing, some of the fine people upholding their country, or if they're now living here in the United States, their country of origins economies, happen to be Asian Hispanics. You know what I'm
Mhm.
saying? Koreans, Chinese, and Japanese who not only speak Spanish, but are to a good degree culturally in tune with their own respective country, wherever they now reside or happen to be citizens of.
Mhm.
So, in one sense, non-Hispanic, I'm sorry, non-Asian Spanish Americans or Latin American Hispanics would have to recognize that these Asians who speak Spanish and are very much culturally like them, and in a lot of cases, with supplies are citizens of their own respective country or country of origin, are serious contributors to their respective countries.
Mhm.
Well, I'm not insisting that these folks, specifically non-Asian, Latin American Hispanics or Spanish Americans, need to be so grateful to these ethnically Asian Hispanics, or they gotta give them cookies or something absurd like that. But just simply like acknowledge these Asians are meaningful contributors, and they are also culturally and linguistically competent as Hispanics who also speak Spanish, just happen to be ethnically differently, or they're ethnically different, and perhaps maybe speak another language that's an Asian language and have some cultural dynamics that reflect that they have roots in some Asian country.
Mhm.
So to summarize what I just said, recognize and appropriately, in a self-respecting sense, appreciate and be grateful to these Asians for contributing to your respective country or country of origin.
Mhm.
I mean, if I may ask you a question? Would you be willing to speak to how oftentimes is the case in Central America and South America? I guess Peru might be an exception, depending on your political background with respect to Fujimori. But other than that, it tends to be the case that Asian Hispanics in Central South America, if they're in government, especially elected politics, they tend to be respectable politicians.
Right.
Would you be willing to like address some of that?
Yeah, I believe that most of the politicians that are of Asian descent in Central America, they tend to be more respectable because since they're very small,
Mm,
and they're not originally part of the caste system of Latin
right,
America, which has always been composed of white Spaniards or other white minorities. So
right.
you know, they kind of take like a middleman approach. So people tend to they tend to respect them more, and they see them more as people that are not seen as oppressors compared unlike those of white or Middle Eastern descent.
Absolutely. Then I wish to add that it's oftentimes the case that, let's see, specifically Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, or say in the case of Peru, a mixture of two or three of those Asian ethnicities, people tend to bring their Confucian or culturally Confucian values and work ethic into their politics. So they have this sense of honor, do right by the people, for the people, don't be prone to graft and corruption, and take the duty or work of government seriously. Competence matters, in other words, as they would say in China. I
Right.
would also stress that now this, I have to be careful I word this because I don't want to blanket condemn the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of Rome's otherwise fine, outstanding people. But even then, I want to stress that, given what I just said, I believe that one reason why we see in Central America a lot of Korean politicians tend to do right by their people is that they subscribe to some sincere, theologically conservative form of evangelical Protestantism, which stresses hard work and honesty, right?
Hmm.
Whereas historically, depending where you go in Latin America, the Roman Catholic Church at times would enable graft and corruption or intentionally engage in graft and corruption to protect her place in society and maintain a certain kind of influence to nearly outright control over government.
Hmm.
So what I'm getting at is the belief system of a lot of these conservative evangelical Protestant Latin Asian politicians, in my view, tends to protect them from political, and more so political Latin Roman Catholic politics and political corruption.
Hmm.
So
Yes,
basically, culture and religion.
right. I agree with you. I do have to say that unfortunately, in many Latin American countries, the Roman Catholic Church is intertwined with the state, and they are pretty much the official religion. And most of the presidents of Latin America, you know, not in all cases, but in many cases, are Roman Catholics. So they tend to be the benefactors of the church, and
Right, absolutely.
that's one of the reasons why when there's been revolutions in Latin America, most of the people are against the church because, as in the case of many Latin American Christianic families that own everything, the Catholic Church in Latin America, they also own half of the land and half of the resources. So
Yeah, so let's
that's
add a
a
little
major
bit to that.
problem. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Absolutely, that's a major problem. So I want to build off of what you just said. As you said, that it is the case in a lot of Latin American countries that, in one sense, the Roman Catholic Church is the official religion. I suppose that what we ought to stress is that it's more of the de facto official religion as opposed to the outright de jure official religion. And the significance of us noting that is, although, except for Argentina, the Roman Catholicism is not like the state church, so to speak,
And
of
also
the
Cuba.
country.
And also Cuba.
Cuba. Thank you. Right, right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We'll go to Cuba in a moment. The thing is, as you were getting at, there's just too much political, social, and even economic influence and nearly outright control coming from the Church of Rome's respective bishops' conference or conference of bishops in that country over the state. Now, it's like and if anything, before we get to Cuba, let's briefly point something out. During the Cold War, whenever Marxist revolutions would occur, or Marxist spy revolutions would occur, sometimes the Roman Catholic Church's Jesuits, who are more inclined towards socialism and rank communism, but in the name of Christ, they would support people's revolutionaries and even be involved in Marxist terrorism. Now, I'm not saying this to take a swipe at Marxism and the well-meaning ideals in various forms of communism, but what I'm trying to speak to is this reoccurring problem in Latin America. Traditional conservative Roman Catholicism, as you said, so embedded with the state and aristocracy, creates all these socioeconomic problems in society that the people at the lower echelons of society want to revolt. And it just so happens, as per what I'm talking about right now, the more left-wing Marxist communist inclined aspects of the Church of Rome, in this case, if we could accept this, ordained Jesuit priests enable and support violent revolutions, and then the state, tied with its more traditional Roman Catholic clergy, engages in a civil war. So when you get down to it, a lot of Latin America's socioeconomic, class-based fascism / conservatism versus communism disputes and civil wars were perpetrated by two factions of the Roman Catholic Church. And on top of that, to summarize, the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America or in various Spanish American countries oftentimes created the original problems that which the more left-wing people society and the clergy wanted to respond to, and ultimately took some violent, bloody measures to correct or ameliorate the original problems that the more conservative, aristocratic aspects of Roman Catholic society and the clergy created. So you see how the Roman Catholic Church, in one sense, in Latin America, created the problems, and then another aspect of it exacerbated the problems. So saying all this, I really believe that in one sense, Asian Hispanics still in Central and South America who are professing and truly and sincerely born again, Bible believing evangelical Protestant Christians are part of basically those two regions' last best hope and bulwark against rank Marxism that rejects God and Christ and a more Roman Catholic form of Marxism in the form of, I don't know, or the guise of, or not the guise, in the iteration that we would call liberation theology. Mm-hmm. I know I said a lot, but if anything, it's like if you're like me, where you're committed to anti-communism while still acknowledging the legitimate concerns that socialism wishes to address, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of these Hispanic, more so Central and South American evangelical or Protestant evangelical politicians are part of this bulwark against this growing problem. Now, before we get off this soapbox regarding how bad the Roman Catholic Church is, and I say this as somebody who once upon a time wanted to be an ordained Roman Catholic priest or deacon,
I did not know that.
I never shared that with you, but we should explore that another time. But with that stated, as per things are more pertinent and germane to this exchange, I want to stress that as bad as quote unquote the Roman Catholic Church is in Latin America, end quote, there are progressive evangelicals, in my view, who are both Asian and non-Asian, who are destabilizing South America and more so Central America. And they've embraced a more Protestant evangelical form of liberation theology. That so much so that they sided with Hugo Chavez when he was alive, and they're now siding with Maduro. Mm-hmm. And they've let's see, in Bolivia, they sided with oh my goodness, I forgot his name.
Evo Morales.
Yes, exactly. exactly. Like they you see what I'm saying? These are supposedly more Orthodox Christians who believe in what I'm convinced is supposed to be the Bible's understanding and presentation of the gospel, but yet they have sided with socialists and openly praised them in
Mhm.
various ways. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that evangelicalism within itself is not Central and South America's last best hope, because there are high profile professing evangelicals who, in my view, are condoning both Asian and non-Asian, mind you,
Mhm.
who are condoning some, to quote the language of the last American president, some bad hombres.
Right. I this
And
is
yes, I intentionally
go ahead. I'm sorry.
mispronounced. I intentionally mispronounced hombres because Trump said hombres.
No, don't worry about it. It's fine. But like I was gonna add to that. The only way Latin America is able to have reforms and change. Latin America needs to be allowed to implement reforms. And one of the reasons why Latin America has remained in economic ruins had to do with the United States in decades of past wanting to dominate those countries, either by supporting fascist dictators that were loyal to Washington's interests, but also being a pariah towards the people. That's one. Number two, um, there needs to be secularization of these countries. And what I mean by secularization is that the church needs to be de-established, and there needs to be freedom of religion, true freedom of religion. Three, there needs to be universal suffrage, and number five, there needs to be compulsory, mandatory education from the first grade up until college, because that's the only way people are going to move forward. Like, again, I even mentioned this many times in my group, that why is it that many Asian countries are economically doing better than many Hispanic countries, and these countries are not even Western. These countries in Asia do not share Western concepts of government, history, language, or culture, even though some of these countries were colonies. And a lot of it has to do because of universal education. Like, if you look in many countries in Latin America as a whole, the entire literacy rate of entire Latin America, and I am excluding Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Argentina, and Uruguay, and Costa Rica, is 45%. While if you look at most countries of East Asia, like China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, even many countries in Southeast Asia, their literacy is 100%. And the reason why that is because the government has made it mandatory for people to go to school. Yeah, and that's a problem that in Latin America, is that the governments don't have universal education, and also the culture does not emphasize education, meaning that when you look at many people in Latin America, you have people that are highly educated, and you have people that don't have any education. So when Hispanics come to the States, they struggle in getting better high paying jobs. It's not because they're ignorant or they're dumb. It's because they don't have the tools to better themselves. And I think that is something that I think Hispanics from many Asian countries, in terms of implementing universal education in their home countries.
Absolutely. Now, it needs to be noted that there is a meaningful historical correlation between the countries that underwent some Protestant Reformation or embraced the Protestant Reformation, and how the educational reforms stemming from the Christian Renaissance's humanism that ultimately accumulated in the Reformation embittered societies. So if we were to just focus on England alone, we could do this other countries, but let's focus on England alone. In Protestant England, there was this understanding that our children are going to be literate because we want them to be able to read the Bible for themselves and have that meaningful personal relationship with God. In order for our children to be literate, we're going to ensure that there's going to not only be classes available for them, but they will go to school. And that ethos was brought in over here, especially by the Puritans. And as Max Weber or Weber has written about, there was a Protestant work ethic. This idea that, okay, the Protestant country is going to do economically well. Because they have a certain ethos or understanding of work and how work is blessed and sacred by God, even if it's not clerical or ecclesiastical, it's still good if you're doing God's will. So go work, was undergirded by this understanding that you and your people, especially your children, need to be literate so they could know what God's talking about. How are you know what God's talking about? The Bible. All right, so let's make sure we're all literate with our kids so we can read the Bible for ourselves. As you, I'm sure, already know, the Spanish Empire said, oh no, we're not going to have that. We're going to have a counter reformation and an inquisition to go after these Lutheran, as they said back in the day,
Hmm.
for Protestant
Reformers.
heretics.
Reformers.
Exactly. No, well, see, during the period of the counter reformation, they actually regularly used the word Lutheran to describe Protestants because Luther was the major reformer, as you were
Right.
alluding to. So
Right.
with that stated, one reason why the Hispanic world has been behind it's more Anglo and Nordic counterparts was because Madrid Toledo and then later Madrid intentionally said no to the Reformation and even had a transatlantic and trans-Pacific Inquisition go after any alleged heresy and deviation from Roman Catholic dogma and practice. Now, with that stated, before we get, I want to stress something regarding Asia. One reason why Asians, especially the Japanese, South Koreans, Taiwanese, and mainland Chinese, have high literacy rates is because their own, as you already spoke to this, their cultures value literacy, and as I alluded earlier, they value competency. But another factor is that what a lot of people don't really know is that these three countries, all these countries I listed, were beneficiaries of Canadian, British, American, and later Australian missionary efforts
New Zealanders as well.
during okay, fine. Later, New Zealand, right. So at this time, New Zealand was part of Australia. So fine, we'll give honor to whom honors due. New Zealand, New Zealand missionary efforts in these countries, Protestant missionary efforts for stress education. In fact, it's been the last, let's see, 5 to 20 years that various academics, especially Chinese and Taiwanese academics, have written respectable publications from Ivy League universities and even leading Taiwanese universities, establishing that the reason why these countries are highly literate, especially Republican era China, was because what the missionaries did on the ground to just educate children, boys and girls, and if you will, spread their understanding of the gospel and Christian practice, which entails being able to read the Bible for yourself,
Hmm.
enabled all all these people in their societies to become literate. Essentially, so let's just focus on one example. In the late 1800s and very early 1900s, before the Qing dynasty collapsed, what happened was the Protestant missionaries from these Anglo-Saxon countries, as well as Belgium, or not Belgium, let's see, Germany, were successful in educating a bunch of men who later became leaders in the early Republic of China within the Ministry of Education, that oftentimes they remembered their lessons from the Protestant missionary schools and thought, oh, now that we're in charge of education policy, we're going to use what we were taught, and we're also going to use some particular curricular materials that the missionaries use with us and see to it that our children become literate in our own language. In fact, a lot of people don't readily. This is not so germane for our original conversation, but this needs to be noted. One reason why, let's see, a bunch of language reforms argued during the late Qing dynasty and early Republican era in China ultimately were successful. The May 4th move in 1919 was because basically the missionaries just made some meaningful changes on the ground in how to write a certain kind of Mandarin that was basically palatable for men who weren't so educated but were literate and highly literate aristocrats and bureaucrats, that what essentially happened was is that those changes made by the missionaries and how to write in a more modernized form of Mandarin ultimately influenced a bunch of language reformers who demanded change in using the language and even just writing literature that the people who were even more secular and open to communism ultimately won the argument with the May 14th movement. And it's like the reason why I say this is because it's like if it weren't for these Protestant missionaries just trying to educate children and get them to be able to read the Bible in their own language and even be able to speak at least one Western language, there wouldn't have been enough educated people from the late Qing dynasty to take over the Ministry of Education or become respectable authors of early modern Chinese literature to basically make some meaningful educational and literary changes in China that ultimately made it possible for the communists to just simplify the language even more and increase the literacy rates in mainland China.
Hmm.
That's just one example out of many. Now, in the Roman Catholic Church, I hate to say this, but such a thing never happened. In fact, let's just cover one more example that speaks to this to why Latin America has historically been behind their more Protestant, non-Latin counterparts. France was, in her own right, behind up until the late mid 19th century in education, until, I'm sorry to say I forgot his name, a Protestant minister of education took over and made major reforms. I actually read, let's see, about 5 months ago, a book on, I'm sorry, more than 5 months ago, on the history of the French language, and it pointed out that that when the French were taking over other parts of the world, they weren't able to adequately, especially in Africa, teach their their colonized subjects French at first because they didn't have enough meaningful education reforms in their own country. And although this book didn't stress the major educational reforms made by this Protestant minister of education, the aforementioned Protestant minister of education, this book basically point out in passing that major educational reforms that made it possible for the French to have an easier time teaching all these sub-Saharan Black people how to learn and speak French occurred after this aforementioned Protestant minister of education took over France. In fact, if anything, this book pointed out that depending where you go to like southern France, like places far away from Paris, it's common to see a poster in a classroom showing like a teacher trying to teach all these kids in a blacksmith's forge how to read and write, and the poster's captioned with "Education before whatever the name of this Protestant minister of education's name is." And so this is not to disrespect our Roman Catholic friends, family members, and loved ones and their church, but this is more to speak to why Latin America is behind these parts of the world that aren't Latin or that aren't Western, but have been meaningfully, in some form or other, impacted by the Protestant Reformation stress on everybody who's able to see and who's intellectually uh, capable enough needs to be able to read the Bible for himself or herself. So literacy matters.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And
I'm coming from a place, I want to add something. I'm
sure.
coming from a place and saying all these things where I honestly hope, and I'm not saying this in vindictiveness to Roman Catholicism, but I sincerely hope that as evangelical, Bible believing Christianity, so to speak, triumphs throughout Spanish or Latin America, that's going to happen is that people's lives are going to get better. Now, I will just like to briefly note, I've noticed that it seems to me that Central American evangelical families are doing well these days, and their children and grandchildren are going off to college, and where this applies are becoming department chairs. Yes, I know some independent fundamental Baptist pastors who are professors and even department chairs from Central America.
Hmm.
And it's like I basically just what I'm saying is that as the gospel, what I hope is will happen is as the gospel spreads, not so much evangelical Protestant, but as biblical Christianity spreads throughout Latin America, people's lives will improve by way of education, which, to build off of something you spoke of earlier, will enable people to meaningfully build and improve on their lives in a profoundly economic sense.
Mhm. I agree with you. I agree. And how do you feel in relation to Asian Hispanics with other Hispanics? How do you think that would bridge that gap of its estrangement?
Okay. Well, I already okay. So, to summarize two things I said earlier. Oh, from eight. Oh, I understand. I apologize. The question this time is oriented. The orientation of this question is Asian Hispanics to non-Asian Hispanics. Okay,
Correct.
sure. I'm of the view that okay, Asian Hispanics. So we're gonna have to exclude a lot of Filipinos right now and focus on, say, people who are what, Chinese, Peruvian, Japanese, and what, a mixture of two of those three Asian ethnicities from Latin America. Okay, right? Is that our focus right now?
That's correct.
Those Asian Hispanic speakers. Okay, those Asian Hispanics, in my view, need to, where this applies, not look down on their non-Asian counterparts. Again, where that applies, because I'm going to just be candid. I know Han Chinese Central Americans or Central Americans of Han Chinese descent, they don't look down on their non Han Chinese counterparts. I can tell you that. I know Japanese Peruvians who don't do the same. And I personally know a Mexican Japanese teacher of the Japanese language who doesn't look down on more indigenous and mestizo Mexicans. If anything, she proudly identifies as Mexicans and she resents a lot of anti Mexican, anti Hispanic, and anti-immigrant sentiments and xenophobia. So again, where this applies, the Asian Hispanics from Latin America who look down on their non-Asian Hispanic counterparts need to stop doing just that. It's just simple as that. They have to, so to speak, repent of that sin. And the next thing for them to do, in my view, would be to more openly identify with their, if they live in the United States, with their country of origin. And I can tell you this, I know of South American Koreans where they do that anyway, or when they have the opportunity to do so, they'll do that. But I think what they need to do is in English, to better speak to your question, they need to say, I'm Korean, or I was born in South Korea and I moved to this Latin country. I spent my formative years there. I speak Spanish, so I'm also fill in the blank Latin country, Bolivian, Chilean, Argentine. You see what I'm saying, right?
Mhm.
So it's a matter. So basically, they would have to, in English, self-identify more with their Latin country of origin or that they migrated to at some age.
Mhm.
I think that will definitely help. And one reason why I say that is because I recall seeing close to 4 years ago on Facebook, I believe a group of Asian Latin American students, I think attending the University of California at Berkeley or UC Berkeley, mostly made up of, let's see, students who came here at a young age from a Latin American country, and also who, let's see, were born to Latin American or Asian Latin American immigrants or or migrants who left a Latin country and moved to the United States, and they were celebrating that they were Latin American or Hispanic and Asian. They were also stressing on this group that that not only is being Asian, Hispanic, or Latin American a thing, it's something that they want to share with the rest of the world, especially their own community on campus. So what's illustrative, informative of this group and the people who comprise it is that they were trying to, in a positive celebratory sense, not just self-identify as Asian Hispanic or Latin American Hispanic, they're like, hey, we exist and we want to share with you the positives that we have from our own kind of hybridity. Would you care to join us? I think that's what, but mind you, these are college age kids. I think older adults, they need to proactively do that in a way that reflects their own values, coming from a sincere, authentic place.
Mhm.
That would really help the situation. Because again, as I acknowledged earlier, there are numerous Hispanic Asians from Latin or Spanish America who don't look down their non Asian counterparts. You know, they don't do that. And if that's them, they just need to, I think, proactively, as I said, do two things. One, in English, identify more with their Latin or Spanish American country. And two, be like those college kids and say, hey, like if you're down, I'm willing to share with you, my whatever you want to call it, Asian Latin hybridity, and oftentimes I think you would agree with me on this, is people tend to feel more comfortable getting together and talking about their differences and similarities over relatable things such as dances, martial arts, and absolutely what we love to put in our mouths, food.
Mhm.
I mean, have you ever had Latin Asian food? It's great stuff.
To be honest with you, I never have. And
Okay.
there is a Latin Asian restaurant in Burbank that I did a delivery once, long time ago, but I never had a
Okay.
chance to try
Here's a
it.
suggestion. Here's a suggestion. Why don't we go there sometime when things are safer? And then, assuming there are things there that work with our diets, we talk, enjoy the food, and then we have another segment where we talk about Latin Asian cuisine with a focus on our experience and suggestions to our friends and loved ones, especially through way of your podcast. That yeah, if you're Latin Asian, be proud of your fusion or your food, and share it more with people. Don't be afraid to share it, especially if you live in Southern California, which is arguably the world's foodie capital.
Hmm. I agree with you. Excellent. Thank you so much for your time and for your feedback. I think it was very constructive, and I think it's gonna be an eye opener for many people in the audience listening, because a lot of people are not aware of Asian Hispanics, and I think when Asian Hispanics are more inclusive in the wider Hispanic community, and at the same time being recognized as a subgroup, I think that can create dialogue, mutual exchange, and also improve relations with the other Hispanic community. Because, like I said, Hispanics are not monolithic. We are composed of different ethnicities, cultures, backgrounds. What unites us as a people is language, culture, and identity. And one of the things that I started with Spanish United is the motto of culture over color. It's like it doesn't matter what is your color, your ethnicity, or your background. If you're Hispanic, you speak Spanish, or you have a Hispanic identity, you should be you should be welcome and embraced as being part of this the Hispanic culture as a whole.
Absolutely. And hopefully, as time goes on, by way of our respective and joint efforts, and I pray and hope by your podcast and all that Spanish United does, more and more Hispanics would want to unite in a way with this understanding that we are a broad coalition of ethnicities. And when I say nationalities, I mean citizens of nation states. As I shared with you yesterday over the phone, it's like our people, or yeah, our people, that's the Hispanic people, live on 5 continents. We have 5 continents. We transverse a good three. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. We'll go with three oceans. You see what I'm saying?
Hmm.
It's like, and as I share, and since you have you are Sephardic Jewish, um, and once upon a time were an observant Orthodox Jew. I mean, we are like one of the few like people or civilizational groups on this planet that are both made up of Jews and Gentiles. It's like we're like our people, the Hispanic people, and we have our own Jewish population in subset. We have various Gentile groups or nations, ethnicities that aren't Jewish. I mean, it's like we could accomplish a lot if we just could appreciate that we are a united people made up of various respectably good and otherwise and absolutely enjoyable differences. We just have to, and unite and building off of some things you believe already, recognize its culture. I would say sometimes we should use this other C word, civilization over color.
Hmm.
Yeah, and we're a broad, diverse civilization. We're capable of a lot, crying out loud. I mean, I know this is redundant, but 5 continents. We're the only people, other than all of the Jewish people, who live on 5 continents with our own countries and nation states to ourselves. We could accomplish a lot. And if anything, I want to conclude by saying this as a Filipino American who self identifies as Hispanic and appreciates his own Asian Hispanic heritage with very Austronesian characteristics. I hope that my own people, the Filipinos, will at some point want to be like their second or third president in their history to say, yeah, we're Hispanics, we're one people, let's be one united bloc that gets things done for the good of all the world within the international community.
I agree with you 100%. I
Yeah.
wanted to thank
Thank
you
you for
so
having me.
much. Not a problem. I want to thank you so much for being on the show. I truly appreciate it. We're definitely gonna get together later on. Hopefully, if God permits. And
Amen.
as soon as I conclude, I will send you the link to the podcast.
Thank you. It was a pleasure having you. And I hope to come back again to continue this dialogue or one similar to it.
Definitely. Have yourself a wonderful night, Trinity. You take care of yourself.
You too. God
Have a
bless
good
you.
night.
Good
Bye bye.
night.